Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. This is going to be one of those videos that's more like a podcast, so if you're looking for a lot of game board action, I've got a million other videos that have that, so stick with me if you want to learn something about chess etiquette. There was a tweet today that kind of triggered me to do this. I'll read the tweet to you. The tweet says, "My Game 3 opponent told me that he tricked his Game 2 opponent into a touch rule blunder. By not saying check, his opponent missed it, touched his queen, and was forced to use her to block the check, costing them the game." And then they said, "What do you think about this?" Okay, so let's talk about saying check. A lot of people know from great-grandparents or wherever, reading an old book, that many years ago in the early half of the 20th century and before, the rule was that whenever you check someone, you had to say check. But that rule was removed, probably before I was born. So it's been removed for a long time. And what I tell people is saying check is optional, which means it's not against the rules to say check. But what I found is when you play stronger players, and by stronger I mean maybe above 15 or 1600, the higher their rating, the more they consider it an insult. Because if you say check, you're kind of almost disturbing them, and they look at you like, "What am I, an idiot? Why are you telling me it's check? Of course I see it's check. Why are you talking down to me like that?" So what I learned pretty quickly as I got to be a better player is you don't say check against stronger players because it's considered an insult. Now, if you're playing someone who's just beginning and you're trying to help them with the rules, of course it makes sense that maybe when you're playing to say check so they know to look at the board and see that their king is in check and they have to get out, and that avoids the kind of problem that they talked about in the tweet. But actually, when they said they tricked their Game 2 opponent into a touch rule blunder, I don't think they tricked them. They actually were just following the rules. If you check someone and you don't say check and they don't see it, that's their fault, not your fault. You're not tricking them. And when they touch the wrong piece and then they have to use that piece to interpose to get out of the check, that's part of the penalty. When you make an illegal move, it doesn't negate touch move. What happens, of course, in those situations is you must get the tournament director, like you always do in those situations, and he'll say, okay, it's touch move as well as you made an illegal move, so they're going to tell you you still have to move that queen, even though you don't want to move the queen in the way to stop the check, because you'll lose your queen. So I kind of disagreed with the idea that they tricked the opponent that way. It just, the opponent wasn't very alert and missed the check, and that happens, but that doesn't mean it was considered bad etiquette to do that. Okay, let's talk about some of the rules of chess. Let's go over to, let's see here. We'll go to the Illinois Chess Association's list of sportsmanship and etiquette. Let me get out the rule book, and I'm going to read you what it says about annoying behavior. Annoying behavior prohibited. It is forbidden to distract or annoy the opponent in any manner whatsoever. A director, upon a complaint by the opponent, has the discretion to determine whether any particular behavior is in violation of this rule and to impose penalties. All right, there's no rule against specific things, because there's no way they're going to list 5,000 different things someone can do, like talking too loud or shaking the board or, coughing or, you can list a million different things. Well, some of those things, if they're inadvertent, might be okay. Anything done on purpose is probably not so okay, but it's up to the tournament director to decide what's reasonable. If you go up to the tournament director and say, "My opponent is breathing, it's annoying me," and the tournament director says, "Well, is he breathing really loud or in some strange way?" and you say, "No, he's not. He's just breathing normally, but it bothers me." The tournament director is going to say, "Well, every opponent is going to be breathing if they're alive, so unless they're doing something strange and they're breathing, I am not going to penalize them just because it bothers you." So it's up to the tournament director to decide whether somebody's doing something that deserves either a warning, which is a lot of times that's what you do. You just ask someone to stop, especially if they're not doing it on purpose. You ask them to stop, and if they continue not to stop, then you watch the game, and at that point you might impose some sort of penalty. But you're not allowed to purposely bother your opponent. So I like to tell some stories to illustrate the point. Many years ago, I was playing a match against National Master Rich Pariseau, And we were playing an endgame that was very complicated, and both of us were taking a lot of time on every move. But finally, as eventually happens, the smoke started to clear, and I noticed that I probably had a winning continuation. And I calculated that if I promoted a pawn on the 8th rank, that when Rich had to take it, it would force his king to the 8th rank, and then when I promoted my other pawn, I could do it with check, and that would give me the tempo to win the game. So what I did was, I didn't make my move. I looked up to Rich with my clock running, and I said, I see what I have to do. I said, I'm going to push my g-pawn until your king captures it on the 8th rank, and then I'm going to push my b-pawn and queen with check, and then I'll have one extra tempo, and that tempo will enable me to catch your pawn, and I can win. Now, Rich could have done lots of things at that point. He could have said, Dan, don't talk to me. And at that point, I still didn't hit the clock. My clock was still running. I had plenty of time. Rich could have said to me, Dan, please don't talk to me when we're playing. He could have gotten a tournament director to admonish me for talking to him. Or he could have done what he did, which is to realize I was trying to help him. I was trying to say, I know how to win the game. Here's how I'm going to win it. And if you agree with me, we'll just save ourselves some time. And my clock's running. I'm not trying to bother you. I'm actually trying to help you. And Rich understood all that. And he looked up at me and he said, you're right. That wins. I resign. So I was talking to him to try to help, not try to disturb him. And if he had interpreted that the wrong way, I shouldn't say the wrong way, if he had interpreted that as I was disturbing him in any way, he certainly was within his right to ask me not to do that or to get a tournament director to tell me not to do that. But he didn't interpret it that way. He interpreted it the same way I intended it, which was I was trying to help him. And that makes sense. For instance, suppose you're in a tournament and you're going to go get a glass of water and you want to get your opponent a glass of water and you haven't yet made your move. And now you make your move, but instead of hitting the clock, you say to your opponent, I'm going to get some water. Would you like some water? Your opponent shouldn't, since your clock's still running, your opponent shouldn't say to you, please don't talk to me. He's allowed to do that. It's certainly within his right, but it's an interpretive thing. Again, if he interprets it as it's not bothering him, you're trying to be nice and get him a glass of water, then he can just say no thank you or thank you. If he doesn't want you to say anything, he could certainly ask you not to. But the right way to do it, of course, would be while your clock's running. This gets to the idea of what's the right etiquette or what's the right procedure for offering a draw in an over-the-board game. When you're playing online, there's usually a button, and you can hit the button and offer a draw. And when you're allowed to hit that button, probably there's not a lot of rules around it. But in an over-the-board game, the correct way to offer a draw is you make the move. That's called determining your move. You determine your move, but then you don't hit the clock. Hitting the clock is called completing your move. You determine your move by making your move and taking your hand off the piece. Then you offer your opponent a draw on your time with your clock running. Then you hit the clock immediately so that they can consider it on their time. So you're not talking while they're thinking. So therefore, you're not theoretically disturbing them. You're doing it right. And then they have the choice. They can do one of three things. They can accept the draw. They have to do it on that move. Of course, they can't wait 30 moves till they're losing terribly and then accept a draw. They can accept the draw. They can decline the draw. Or they can just make a move, which by de facto declines the draw. And that's all quite reasonable. If your opponent illegally offers you a draw when they haven't moved yet, then you can say to them, please make a move and I'll consider it. Now, does that fall under etiquette or under rules? It's more under rules than under etiquette. So let's get back to a little bit of etiquette questions. Let's go to the rule book here. I think I brought up the rule book. Okay, resigning etiquette or resigning rules. You could consider it etiquette or rules. There's really only two ways to resign. I'll read it what Rule 13b says for USCF. The player whose opponent resigns wins the game. This immediately ends the game. Saying I resign or tipping over the king are relatively clear ways to resign. Stopping both clocks does not necessarily indicate a resignation. This is over the board. Of course, online there's a resign button. Since a player may be making a claim or seeing a director, the opponent should not assume a player who stops both clocks has resigned without further evidence. Now, if a player one of the ways people often resign is over the board, they stop both clocks and they offer a handshake and they don't go to get the director. That's very common, but it's not necessarily a resignation. If someone says to them, "Are you resigning?" they shouldn't get mad. They should just nicely say, "Yes, I am." I've seen people get mad in that situation and say, "What do you think I'm doing?" But actually, the person who got mad was the one who's doing it wrong, not the person who asked them politely, "Are you resigning?" And the next paragraph says, likewise, the offer of a handshake is not necessarily a resignation. On occasion, one player believes the handshake agrees to a draw while the other interprets it as a resignation. So basically what they say in the rule book is handshakes mean nothing. If you handshake with someone, that doesn't end the game. That doesn't mean you're agreeing to a draw. It doesn't mean you're resigning. It doesn't mean they're resigning. Handshakes don't have that rule. If it's going to be a draw, that means someone offered the draw and the opponent clearly accepted. If it's a resign, either they said, "I resign," or they purposely tip over their king, not accidentally. That would be resigning. Okay, so those are questions of rules, but they're also somewhat questions of etiquette. Let's get back to some of the etiquette that we talk about both in the Illinois State Chess Federation here. And I have a book called Everyone's Second Chess Book. Chapter 13 is chess etiquette. Let me read you the way the chapter starts. According to legend, a chess journalist once asked Bobby Fischer, who was famous not only for being a great chess player, but also for being difficult, if he liked to bother his opponents. "Oh yes," Fischer immediately answered. Sensing a juicy reply, the questioner quickly followed up, "And what do you do?" "Oh, I make good moves," said Fischer. Not many of us can make good moves like Bobby Fischer, but everyone should know about chess etiquette. Sometimes it is hard to find this information, but sooner or later most tournament players figure it out, sometimes the hard way. And then I go along and I talk about chess etiquette. And I break it down into two types of etiquette. I said we can separate etiquette into two types. Etiquette that applies all the time, whether you're playing a friendly game or a serious one, and etiquette that is more particular to tournament play. And I start out with some things about etiquette that applies all the time, whether you're in a formal game or an informal game. And the first one is what I just said. Don't bother your opponent in any way. And I said this rule takes many forms, and we just talked about it. It's really requiring interpretation. If your opponent thinks you're bothering them, then they certainly have the right to say so. If you think it's unreasonable, and in any case, you're allowed to talk to your opponent about that, but I suggest it's better to get the tournament director when you're playing online, of course, and people start typing at you, very often you can mute them, you can do things so that they can't type at you, but over the board, best thing to get is to get the tournament director. Greeting your opponent. Usually it's a good idea to shake hands with your opponent. If it's during a pandemic and you don't want to touch them, you could bump elbows or wave at them or give them a nice bow. You can offer them good luck whether you mean it or not. Usually when you play at a game, you're using black's board and set. Black starts white's clock to start the game. All right, we just talked about resigning. I won't go into that. Ways of moving the pieces. All right, normally you're supposed to nicely take your piece, put it down on a square. You're not supposed to hover with the piece in the air. You're not supposed to keep your hand on your piece for a long period of time, looking around to see if you want to complete the move. A lot of people like to intimidate their opponents by screwing in their pieces or banging them on the board. That's unacceptable. If they do it very mildly, you might ignore it. If they do it to an extent that it does bother you again, simply get your tournament director, tell them what you're doing. Some people like to put the pieces down that are not strictly in the middle of the square to bother their opponent. If they do it on purpose, again, get the tournament director. If they're not doing it on purpose, please ask them to put the piece in the middle of the square. That kind of thing. People ask requests about etiquette for requests to play a game. People said they wanted to stroll around and analyze. They don't, what happens if two people only want to play each other and people ask to play them? Do they have the right to say they don't want to play anyone else? Well, certainly they do if they're at a club and the club allows them to play anyone that they want. But they should, if someone comes up and says, "I'm going to play the winner," they don't have the right to play the winner. unless the two players allow them to do that. So you hear people do that at clubs and stuff, say, I've got the winner. There's no right for them to do that. There's nothing wrong with that, but they have no right that way. So if the two players say, sorry, we're just going to play themselves, and so on. That's the question. Okay, informal play, stopping the clock. All right, basically, there's two times you can unilaterally, well, I shouldn't say two. Maybe there's more than two times. You can unilaterally stop the clock. If you're going to resign, you can unilaterally stop the clock. When I say unilaterally, it means you don't have to ask your opponent, you don't have to do anything. If it's your opponent's move and he's thinking, and you want to go over and ask the tournament director, you wouldn't usually not stop the clock. You would just get the tournament director and let his clock run while he's thinking. If it's your turn and you need to get the tournament director, then you stop the clock and get the tournament director. I actually saw someone do that. They went to stop the clock to get the tournament director, and the opponent said, it's your move, and they hit the clock back, and they wouldn't let the opponent go and get the tournament director. That's very bad etiquette on the opponent's part, and it did cause a little bit of a brouhaha. I think at one point the player considered picking up the clock and stopping it and carrying it away with him to the tournament director so his clock wouldn't be running while. Because a lot of times when you're trying to get the tournament director, it's because you're in time trouble and there's a critical decision you need made, and if your clock keeps running, it's going to cost you the game. So your opponent has no right to do that. On the other hand, you have no right. Let's say your clock is running low and you need more time to think. You can't make up an excuse to get the tournament director just so you can stop the clock and think about what move you're going to make. If the tournament director perceives that you're stopping the clock to ask a phony question just to keep your clock from running, then he could penalize you with taking time off your clock for doing that. I've rarely seen that enforced, but he can do that because you can't stop the clock just to think about things, just to pretend you're going to get ask the tournament director a question when you just made up a question. You can also stop the clock if something happens on the board, like someone spills some food or a drink on the board and you have to clean it off. Obviously you should stop the clock while the board is getting clean. So getting the tournament director, these rare times when something happens to the board, or if you're unilaterally resigning. If you're offering a draw, of course, you can't stop the clock. I've seen people stop the clock because they have to go to the bathroom. That you can't do. You should just make a move, and while your opponent's thinking, go to the bathroom. You can't say to your opponent, I'm going to stop the clock while I go to the bathroom. That's not allowed. In fact, if you did that, then your game would finish after everybody else's game, and if you're playing a tournament, you would hold up the next round. So things like that are not allowed. All right, we talked about offering and accepting a draw. We talked about calling check. Je double. All right, you're allowed to adjust your pieces, but you can only adjust them on your own time. So if your opponent's knight is not in the middle of the square and you want to put it in the middle of the square and it's his turn, you can't reach over and adjust his knight while he's thinking. If you're going to adjust your pieces while you're thinking, it's touch move, so you can't touch a piece, you have to move it. So you have to tell your opponent before you touch a piece that you're not intending to move it. And you could say the French term je double, which means I adjust, or you could say it in English and say adjust. And you could, if you say that before you touch a piece, then you put the piece in the middle of the square, you don't have to move it. Now suppose you are reaching over to get a glass of water and you knock a piece over. That's not purposely touching a piece and you have to move it. In order to touch a piece to move it, you have to purposely grab the piece. If you accidentally knock over a piece, it's not touch move. And obviously you didn't have time to say je double first because you didn't know you were going to knock over the piece. So you could accidentally knock over the piece and then you would say je double and you could pick it back up and put it back on the square. But you're not required to move a piece in that case when you're trying to adjust the piece that way. I was playing in a simultaneous exhibition and the pieces weren't in the middle of the square, and I was playing someone I didn't know, and I got to my board and I saw the pieces needed adjusting, so I said je double and I adjusted the pieces, and my opponent said touch move, and I said, well, I said je double, and he said it doesn't matter, you have to move the piece if you touch it. I said, well, no, that's not the rule. The rule is if you say je double or I adjust before you touch a piece, it means the piece isn't on the middle of the square, that you need to adjust the piece. And he said, I don't care, you have to move the piece. And I said, well, that's not the rule. And also, this is supposed to be a friendly simul. I'm following the rules and I'm saying I adjust. So I made my move on the board and I came around. I was playing like 20 people at the time. And when I came back to the board to the next time around, my opponent had left. I think he told someone that I was cheating and he wasn't going to play. And he left. Well, clearly I wasn't cheating, but he just didn't know the rules, so he thought I was going against the rules. Okay, let's see what it says here in the Illinois State Chess Federation under sportsmanship and etiquette. Be polite, get off to a good start. Tell someone what your name is. Telling someone what your name is also very helpful because the pairings go up on the pairing sheet, and sometimes people sit down at the wrong table. Like they see 19 and they sit down on the left side of it instead of the right side, which is actually 18. And if you just sit down and start playing, you end up playing the wrong person. So being polite and saying, hi, my name's Fred, or whatever, if they saw the pairing sheet that they were paired against Tom, and you said, hi, I'm Fred, then they would know something's wrong, and maybe they would check the board and check to make sure they're sitting in the right place. Next one they say is, don't boast, trash talk, or try to intimidate your opponent. Well, that goes along with the fact you can't even really talk to him during his time. If you talk to them during your time, you're supposed to say things very nicely, like, would you like a draw, is always allowed during, as we said earlier. Or if you're asking him, as I said, while your clock's running, I'm going to make a move and then get some water. Would you like some water? That kind of stuff is okay. That's not trash talking or intimidating your opponent. Don't argue with your opponent. Well, that's a really big one. Every tournament I tell people, if something happens in your game, a legal move, someone interferes, the clock misfunctions, whatever it is, you set up the board wrong, don't argue with your opponent. Don't discuss with your opponent how you're going to resolve it. Just get the tournament director. And yet every tournament, it seems without exception, even in our club with people that have played for years, they talk it over with their opponent and they try to resolve the issue themselves, and crazy things happen. And so not only don't argue with your opponent, but I would say don't discuss rules with your opponent and don't try to resolve any rules with your opponent. All right, next says don't use outside materials. Again, that's not etiquette, that's more a rule. You can't write notes during the game. You can't say, I'm thinking about bishop to b5 check, but I might forget about it, so I'm going to write bishop b5 check on my score sheet so I know to look there before I make my move. Or you can't give yourself little notes like checks, captures, and threats. Every time you're making a move, look for your opponent's checks, captures, and threats. You're not allowed to write that on your score sheet. Don't give or ask for advice. All right? So sometimes people come up to me during a tournament and say, how are you doing in your game? Well, I'll answer them, but I don't want them to say anything back to me. If I say I think I'm doing okay, and they're a good player who've seen my board, they're not allowed to say, I don't agree with you, Dan, because then they're helping me by telling me my evaluation may be wrong. I can do it one way. I can give out advice. I can give out information about my game, but they can't feed it back to me. They can't say whether they agree with me or disagree. They can just listen and say, I know how Dan's thinking, but they can't affect my game in any way. They can't feed back to me. If you're not able to do that, then you're better just not to say anything at all. As a very experienced player, I'm kind of used to where the line on the rules are. And if someone said to me, if a tournament came up and said to me, Dan, you were talking about your game, and even though the opponent wasn't saying anything back to you, I'd prefer you not do that, then I would say, okay, no problem. But I don't want any advice. I don't want to hear anything. I've actually had a couple people over the years give me unsolicited advice, and then I usually told my opponent that I accidentally got advice and that we should null the game. Maybe I would offer him a draw, even though the game just started or something. This has happened once or twice in my career where someone gave me advice that I didn't want, and I was trying not to do it. Don't be annoying. We already covered that one. Stay at or near your game when it's in progress. Well, okay, and if someone hits a clock, you're not allowed to tell other people that someone hit the clock and it's their turn. That's a mild form of cheating. You're not allowed to help people. So if your friend and you are talking and you notice your friend's opponent has just moved, you can't say to him, your opponent just moved, go over there and make your move. It's up to him to figure that out. I see people do this all the time. It's probably the most mild and common form of cheating, is telling people like it's your move. Now your opponent can do that. Your opponent can make a move, get up from the table, walk over to you and say, I just moved, it's your move. He's on purpose allowing you that nicety, but other people can't do that for you. Do not discuss your game in progress with anyone. Well, we just talked about that. Don't talk to anyone in the playing room except to say check, which is optional, or checkmate. Well, again, you could go up to the tournament director and say, I have a question or something, but you want to do it If it's in the same room as where people are playing, you want to do it very quietly so it won't disturb anyone. Don't try to trick your opponent by pretending to have made a bad move. Well, if you're playing an adult and they're wise and you go, oh, no, what did I do? You're basically holding up a big sign saying, either I blundered and you should be careful because you may have a winning move here, or you're holding up a big sign that says, I'm trying to trick you and I really didn't blunder. It's a trap and you might fall into it. But in any case, when you go, oh, no, to someone who's not a little kid, you're basically telling them to be careful. So you're helping them when you say, oh, no, what did I do? Because the only two ways to interpret it is, be careful, I made a big mistake and don't miss it. Or be careful, I actually didn't make a big mistake and you're falling into a trap. And either way, you're telling them to be careful, and why would you want to tell your opponent to be careful? Final one they have here, it's not the final one on the page because the page goes on and on. They say, do not rush your opponent into saying hurry up or move or anything similar. You see that online all the time. Two people are playing a slow game, and one guy, even though he agreed to play a 45-45 game, he really wants everybody to move really quickly. And he says, move. Usually that's someone who's a youngster, a teenager, or someone extremely immature would be doing stuff like that. If your opponent has time on his clock, he has the right to use it, unless it's very, very bad etiquette. If you're dead lost and you have lots of time on your clock and you don't want to resign, you should either move relatively quickly or you should resign. If you're dead lost and you have 45 minutes on your clock, you can't just sit there and let your clock run. If people do that online, and immature people do, then you should report them to the server because they should be aware of that to warn that person so that they don't do that again. The last one I'm going to read here is, after your game, be a good winner or loser. Yes, offer to go over the game with your opponent. If you lost, say good game. If sometimes when you lose and it's a game that's over the board and you say to him, man, I was really had a good position there, and then I messed it all up, and you came from behind, and I feel really bad because you got sort of a lucky win there. Your opponent will kind of smile at you and say, you're right. But if you do that over the online and you say things like that, and people don't realize you're by your tone of voice and by your body language that you're just being a somewhat of a good loser and you're being in good nature. The same things that you could say to someone live and they understand that you're just trying to make, nice talk with them after the game. If you do it online, it comes across very poorly, like you're accusing them of something. So when you just type things, you lose the body language, you lose the tone and all those kind of things. Most people don't feel threatened in real life. If someone who lost goes up and says, oh man, I was winning, you got lucky at the end, they usually smile and say, yes, you did. But when you type those kind of things, it has a completely different result. So you got to be very, very careful. All right, I'm sure there's more things we could go over, but we just wanted to go over some etiquette today. Hope you enjoyed the video. You can tell other people about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess. I would really appreciate it. If you could tell 5 people in the next week that don't know about it, that would be wonderful. You could subscribe, you can like it. We could see you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye.